My name is Ashley Tuck and I work for Wessex Archaeology. I've been very fortunate in that this long-running project has developed at about the same pace as my career. So years ago, I found myself supervising excavation in quite foul conditions in the Lincolnshire marsh. I remember one site was so muddy and wet that I had to change out of my dirty clothes into an intermediate set of clothes and then into clean clothes, so I could get in the van and go to the bed and breakfast at the end of the day. I also had the privilege of writing the grey literature reports for the project, and I now find myself managing and writing the publication. Wessex Archaeology is very grateful to Ørsted Wind Power for funding the work, and to the consultants Royal Haskonian DHV, and to the Heritage Steering Group of County Archaeologists for monitoring the project. So this project was huge. As you can see, it was located in Lincolnshire, which is not particularly close to Hornsea. Hornsea is in East Yorkshire. The Hornsea name refers to the Hornsea offshore wind farm, which is out in the North Sea, somewhere near Hornsea. And the electric cables come in from the wind farm. They make landfall in the parish of Northcote in the east of this figure. And then the onshore cable route is shown in blue, leading all the way through the hinterlands of Grimsby and Immingham to a substation in North Killingholme parish in the northwest of this figure. And it was the impact of this construction, the construction of the cable route, that we studied during these archaeological works. And I just, I've got the spotlight tool. So this blue line here is the route that we were studying. So just as an overview, here are the archaeological sites along the route. The main sites are in red, with some lesser fine spots in yellow. And in addition to these sites, there was also some less significant remains scattered across the scheme, including ridge and furrow and post-medieval drains and agricultural boundaries. The earliest remains came from two locations in Laceby Parish, which are labelled here as Laceby Parish Fine Spot and Laceby Beck. There were a few Neolithic and Bronze Age pottery sherds at these two locations in Laceby Parish. This distribution may reveal that the Laceby Beck, which becomes the River Freshney, which you may know as the main river in Grimsby, it may be that the Laceby Beck had some importance in prehistory. Grimsby occupies a slightly raised area of land that extends through the marshes to the coast, and this raised ground might have been attractive to settlement in the past, as it continues to be today. Some of the Bronze Age pottery that we recovered originates from an enclosure and boundary that were identified by photographic survey, aerial photographs, although we can't demonstrate a link for certain, as the pottery was recovered from the topsoil overlying a ditch, which correlates with this green boundary identified by aerial photographs. Subsequent excavation during a parallel project, I'm talking about Hornsea Project One today, and there's also a parallel project which is Hornsea Project Two, which is still being assessed and analysed. The subsequent excavation during the parallel project has revealed an adjacent Iron Age Romano-British settlement, so it might be that this Bronze Age pottery represents some of the earliest remains associated with a slightly later settlement. The rest of the early prehistoric material came from a site called Laceby Beck that contained mainly Anglo Saxon remains. I'll come on to that in a bit. And alongside the few earlier prehistoric sherds, there were also a few Iron Age and Romano-British pot sherds there, suggesting some kind of sustained low-level activity at that location prior to it flourishing as an Anglo-Saxon settlement. The most common type of site we investigated were Iron Age and Romano-British settlements. Excuse me. We dug 6 of these, as well as some other contemporary less significant remains, such as boundaries. The chief similarity between the settlement sites were that they were all low status. We know from other investigations in the area that there were higher status sites in the region, but the ones we hit were all occupied by the lower echelons of society who didn't have much access to fancy pottery or the material trappings of sophisticated culture. The economy of these sites was revealed by 3 separate threads of analysis. As usually happens, the animal bones were studied, soil samples were taken to investigate ancient plant remains and other environmental evidence. Hornsea Project One also benefited from organic residue analysis of pottery, which is an increasingly frequently used technique that studies the fats contained within the fabric of pottery, and it can determine whether, for example, a cooking vessel was used to process ruminant or non-ruminant fats, so we can separate off horses from sheep, for example, and whether the fats were dairy fats or carcass fats. So roughly a third of the cooking vessels turned out to have been used for dairy, in contrast to 2/3 that were used for carcass products. And these 3 strands of investigation come together and agree. They reveal a consistent picture that the inhabitants of the marsh were subsistence farmers operating generally closed economies. Sheep and cattle were the main animals exploited alongside some pigs and occasionally other animals. The cattle were used for traction and the sheep managed for secondary products such as wool. Cattle, sheep and horses were eaten only at the end of their lives. Tongues and bone marrow were exploited, indicating local slaughter and consumption of the products. And these animals may have been pastured in the wetland areas known as carr, which have been an important pasture for cattle and other animals right up to recent times. I think Daniel Defoe wrote about the pasturing of cattle in the marshes in Lincolnshire. It's likely the same approach may have been used in the Iron Age and Romano-British periods. Arable agriculture was also important. Spelt wheat was favoured over emmer, possibly due to the heavy soils of the marsh. Barley, broad beans, flax, they were all cultivated, and peas were introduced in the late Romano-British period. Arable cultivation might have been situated in slightly higher, drier areas within the marsh, and in one location we even recorded some plough scars from the Romano-British period. There were 2 Romano-British crop drying kilns where grain would have been dried out to stop it from spoiling. Grain was processed both on a household level using querns, but also in a more organised way as we recovered fragments of millstones from 3 quite separate sites within the project. Despite the proximity to the sea, it doesn't appear that marine resources formed a significant part of the economy of these settlements, although some deposits of oyster shell reveal that they were not entirely ignored. We did isotopic analysis of human remains, which confirms that there were low rates of marine diet. Evidence for Iron Age and Romano-British salt working was unexpectedly slim. Briquetage is a type of ceramic which is associated with salt making. It's often found in very large quantities on salt working sites. We found very small amounts of briquetage inland at some of these Romano-British settlement sites. My interpretation of this is that it may represent the consumption of salt rather than the production of salt. It may be that the salt was transported in the briquetage evaporation pans that it was produced in, and they've taken, these were one-use items, and they'd break them when they were done to get the salt out. So maybe they just carried the whole pan inland as a way of transporting the salt. There's some parallels for that from other areas of the country. So another striking similarity, as well as the low status of these sites, is the amount of labour that was dedicated to ditch digging. These are plans of the site at Westfield Farm in North Killingham. There's not time to go through all of this in detail, unfortunately, but I want to give you an impression of the sheer density of archaeological features on these sites and of their highly stratified nature. It's been a really hard job interpreting the detail of the phasing, but the overall picture is reliable. So you can see we've got activity begins in the Iron Age in the top here, and then it goes through all these phases, the different colours, and again there's more phases and then even further ones, and they're all stacked up on top of each other. People were here throughout the late Iron Age and Romano-British periods, and they just kept revising and altering the systems of enclosure and drainage that they already had. And then there's further activity on the site in the medieval and post-medieval periods. I'll get onto that later. But the thing that I see from this incredible density of archaeological features is the importance of ditch digging. It must have been very important to the inhabitants of this site to maintain and improve on these schemes of land division and drainage. I can almost feel a kind of panic and the hardship of the struggle to subsist in the marsh as they repeatedly scoured old ditches and imposed new schemes of drainage on the old ones. I know firsthand what it's like to dig in that wet Lincolnshire clay, and it must have been really essential for these people to maintain these systems of drainage, for them to be so focused on it. The pottery assemblage shows that this large and complex site was a low status, basic rural settlement. It's interesting to note that as the size and complexity of the settlement increased over time, the status of its material culture actually reduced. So the village was becoming larger but poorer. And where did all these people live that were digging these ditches? We identified a surprisingly small number of buildings compared to the size of the settlements. It may be that the buildings on the sites were generally of a type that did not have earth-fast posts. If you put a post in the ground, it may have just rotted away fairly quickly there in the wet marsh. We did identify a few roundhouses, of which this Iron Age example is probably one of the easiest to see, one of the clearest. The arrangement and stratigraphy of the post holes reveal that there would have been multiple phases of building on the same spot. So they've been built one after another, centered on the same center point. So we've got this purple ditch here. If you can see where I'm pointing with that red sort of pointer. That purple ditch there is probably the eaves drip gully of one roundhouse. That is, it's a ditch going around the outside of the building to catch rainwater coming off the roof. And then these green post holes are outside of the purple drip gully, so that's a pretty good clue that they belong to a different phase of building. So there would have been a smaller house contained within the purple ditch, and then there's a slightly larger house where the wall would have followed the line of these green post holes. So there may have been several phases of building on this spot. One interesting artifact we recovered from the house is this dog tooth down the bottom there. It's a perforated canine tooth from a dog. It's the sharp eye tooth, if you like. It's interesting to speculate about it. It may have been an apotropaic amulet. It may have been to protect against evil spirits, or who knows. Or it might just be a memento of someone's favourite pet, maybe. This type of roundhouse continued to be used into the Romano-British period on this site, reinforcing the picture from the pottery and other material culture that the people living on these sites were not extensively Romanized. They were practically and culturally rooted in pre-conquest ways of being. So this settlement is markedly different in form from the others. It was much shorter lived. This is called Chase Hill Road. It was an enclosed settlement that appears to have been occupied only briefly in the late Iron Age. Several roundhouses, these sort of circular things in here, were enclosed by a ditch, one going around the outside. And the ditch may have been accompanied by a palisade. The site closely resembles other enclosed farmsteads in the area, of which the most famous is probably Welsby Avenue in Grimsby. There used to be reconstructions of roundhouses at Welsby Avenue. They're sadly no longer there. The Welsby Avenue site is famous for having developed into a metalworking centre, However, there's no evidence of metalworking from the site at Chase Hill Road, which seems to have just been a simple farmstead. I suppose this is a view of what Wheelsby Avenue might have been if it hadn't developed into a metalworking centre. There's not time to go through each site in detail. I'm just going to whiz through a few of them. This settlement at Eastfield Farm flourished in the late Iron Age and also the 1st century AD, and it comprised enclosures and possible rectangular structure adjacent to a boundary with an alluvial wetland that was adjacent to it. This site at Kilby Road was probably much larger than the area we got to investigate. The two plans here show early and late Romano-British phases of occupation. Although there's no direct evidence of Iron Age activity, the volume of residual Iron Age pottery found in Romano-British features demonstrates that there had been substantial activity on the site during the Iron Age. So whatever ditches and pits they may have dug in the Iron Age were all truncated by later Romano-British activity. I think the Hornsea 2 results have found some Iron Age features just adjacent to this. Station Road is another site. This is Tecni now. An area in the west of the site was inhabited during the Iron Age. It had post-built structures, and here's a nice oval of post holes. And some of these were robbed out. There's more post holes down here with a couple of robber trenches and another one in the middle. And then there's some partial ring ditches down here. You can see those in the photo. They're quite small, and I don't imagine these would be domiciles. I don't think they're big enough to live and sleep in, but they're probably some form of building representing settlement. This is still the same site, Station Road. This is the centre of the site. In this area, an Iron Age enclosure grew into a complex and significant Romano-British settlement. This one persisted probably into at least the early 5th century AD, around the time of the Roman withdrawal. 410 AD is usually given as the end of the Roman period in Britain. So the early 5th century is very much that period of withdrawal. It's quite exciting that we can date the stratigraphically latest features to the very end of the Roman occupation in this area. I'm sorry for going through these so quickly. I'm going to slow down for this one. If I had a few hours, I could talk at greater length about everything. This is Humestone Road, again in Tecni parish. There were 2 excavation areas, these 2 down the bottom, and you can see how they go together at the top. So they are actually next to each other. They're very closely linked. The 2 areas were separated by a modern field boundary that we weren't able to remove. So these 2 excavation areas, you see how they go together at the top. The site was on the boundary between 2 areas of marsh, known as the Middle Marsh and the Outmarsh. The Middle Marsh is in the west, and it's a low-lying area of wetland, and the Outmarsh is in the east, and it's an even lower-lying area of wetter land. And the boundary between the 2 areas roughly corresponds to an area of tidal flats deposits recorded by the British Geological Survey. With notable exceptions, evidence for early occupation is generally absent from the Outmarsh, with the area either unsuitable for occupation or maybe remains there buried below later layers. The site at Humestone Road flourished up until the 3rd century AD, when it was inundated and the eastern coastal end of the settlement was buried between layers of marine sediment. These are the tidal flats deposits recorded by the British Geological Survey. You can see them at the end here. There's these sort of grey layers coming in have covered up the blue and green features of the site. The site appears to have been abandoned at this point when it was inundated and buried by marine deposits, although there was a minor attempt to reoccupy the site in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. But it's not really representative of the settlement. It could be some field boundaries or enclosures. Today, the Humestone Road site lies a minimum of 3 kilometres from the high tide line, but in the Romano-British period, the settlement would have been right on the seafront, albeit there would have been an area of salt marsh, probably greater in extent than the area of the modern marsh is today. There have been substantial changes to the geography of the area throughout history, and I'm going to talk about another change that happened a bit later when we get to talk about salt making at the end of the talk. I'm really pleased with this reconstruction image that we've commissioned of the Humestone Road site. You can see the encroaching wetlands of the outmarsh in the bottom as the sun is setting in the west, symbolising the last days of the settlement. Cattle graze in the wetland car with arable cultivation visible in the west. Geophysical survey suggested that the focus of habitation was probably to the north of the area we dug. That's where we've drawn these roundhouses in the reconstruction. And the settlement was accessed by a prominent trackway. You can see that running through here. The prominent trackway access along the track was controlled at a point where ditches and pits blocked the track. We've interpreted this in the reconstruction as a kind of timber gate, although even though that's quite speculative. We don't know how it would have looked above ground, but we do know that there was a challenge to progress at that point along the trackway, a point of control. And there was a burial here at the side of the track. It was of a woman of advanced age who had lived a life of strenuous activity. There was also a well-healed sharp weapon injury to her skull, so she had been attacked or suffered an injury, and she'd managed to heal that and survive, which reveals that life in the marsh may not always have been peaceful. Okay, I'm going to move on. We're now going to talk about an Anglo Saxon settlement. This is the site I mentioned earlier with the small quantities of Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age and Romano-British pottery. Almost all of the remains on this site, however, date to the 5th to 7th centuries. So we've gone after the Romano-British period, we're now in the Anglo-Saxon period. The region in this period is less well understood than in earlier periods. However, there are 2 nearby Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. These are in Laceby and Aylesby parishes, and either of these could have been the last resting place of the inhabitants of Laceby Beck. Again, due to the shape of the cable route, we got a transect through the site, and I think we missed the core of the settlement, but the comparative richness of the material culture, of which this bone comb is an example, reveals that there was a settlement here somewhere. There were also knives, a book clasp, and textile production objects such as thread pickers, a loom weight, and a limestone spindle whorl. It may be that we dug the midden heaps of the settlement, perhaps, although the remains are open to interpretation. The Anglo-Saxon economy resembled that of earlier periods, as far as the evidence reveals. It's interesting that the finds from this site are probably the highest status from the whole project, higher in status than even those recovered from 2 medieval moated sites that we dug. This is one of the medieval moated sites. This is in Harbour Parish. It's to the east of the modern village, near the medieval St Margaret's Church. There was some limited later prehistoric activity immediately south of the moated site, but occupation of the area of the moat seems to have begun in the Saxo-Norman period. These are in mustard over here. And Saxo-Norman just means roughly the 10th, 11th centuries. It's the period either side of the Norman conquest. The earliest remains comprise mainly drainage ditches, which echoes the focus on drainage from the Iron Age and Romano-British periods. A second phase of drainage was then imposed. We're now looking at these red features in the middle. A second phase of drainage came with some contemporary rubbish pits and beam slots, these 2 here, that probably form the foundation of a building and a variety of other features as well. And there were traces of the moat. You can see down here and extending to the south. Traces of the moat survived from this period, but the moat was scoured or redug in the post-medieval periods, probably in the 18th century or thereabouts. So you can see that the medieval moat was pretty much completely removed when the moat was redug at a later date. The 18th century rescouring may have been an attempt to evoke the meaning of a former seat of power or of a perceived seat of power. The late moat enclosed a smaller area. You can see it comes in here rather than continuing. So cut across the medieval moat platform. The medieval moat extended further south towards the present-day Immingham Road. Immingham Road runs roughly across the bottom there. The second moated site, excuse me, was at Blowfield in South Killingham. This is just across the parish boundary from the Iron Age Romano-British site of Westfield Farm that I've already spoken about. So Westfield Farm is this site at the top here, and then Blowfield is this site immediately south of it. And I've used the name Blowfield for this site because it was already established in the literature about medieval moated sites. So I didn't want to cause confusion by giving it another name. Yeah, we've got a historic map here on the left. This is from the 19th century, the background map here. This shows that the moat was visible as an earthwork in the 19th century, and details in the historic environment record reveal that the moat was filled in only as recently as the 1970s. We got to dig only a small portion of the site. We've got this top corner, and some extending to the north, and also this L-shaped piece down here we managed to dig. Hornsea Project 2 has dug a much larger area coming through here. That project has been done by Network Archaeology and Allen Archaeology, and I hope that at some point in the future they may be able to say a bit more about this site than I'm able to say today. The Hornsea Project One results reveal that the moated site developed in much the same way as the Harborough site, starting with a complex system of drainage onto which a moat was imposed. The early drainage system had been rapidly modified, and I can imagine desperate workers spading out fresh drains in the face of rising water. Again, the site does not appear to have been particularly high status. The moat is very large. In the past, this site has been identified as a deserted medieval village. And I wonder if what we're seeing is something approaching an enclosed settlement, with the moat acting maybe primarily as a large drain. Sorry, just skip back. Yeah, I meant to say back here, we default to imagining moats as enclosing manor houses, but they were actually used to enclose a wide range of things, including the more mundane. They could enclose farms or dovecots, windmills, gardens, orchards. There are 4 moated sites in Harborough Parish, including 3 that are close to the church. Historic records suggest that there were multiple manors in the parish. However, there's no certainty that the moat we dug at Harborough was a high status site in the medieval period. Few high status artifacts were recovered, and it may be that one of the most important functions of the moat was to act as a drain. So I'm sorry for talking these 2 sites down a little bit, but I do think that the drainage function of the moat does seem to have been quite significant. Okay, so one of the most interesting things from the Blowfield site are some human remains that were recovered from a drainage ditch. This is part of the skull here, and pieced back together. These bits have been temporarily stuck on here to piece the elements of the skull back together. These incomplete, partially articulated remains were of a large, physically powerful man. They've been radiocarbon dated to the 12th, 13th centuries. Their burial outside of a churchyard is rare in the medieval period. Those debarred from a church burial could include individuals killed in a tournament or a duel, or pagans, heretics, witches, excommunicants, those convicted of murder or treason, the cursed, thieves, or some cases of suicide or strangers to the parish. So quite a colourful list of possibilities there. A vagrant might have been quickly buried by their fellows before moving on, or the individual may have died in battle or been murdered. The bone appears to have been redeposited, and there are indications that the man met a violent death through a blunt weapon trauma to the skull. The man may have been a victim of a minor skirmish or a murder, and then he appears to have been moved or at least disturbed after he was buried. Perhaps one of the most interesting things here is the place of burial. He was buried right on the parish boundary, and the parish boundary may have been significant in that it's a liminal location between two authorities. So if you stick him on the boundary, maybe no one's responsible for it. To put the moated sites into their local context, we need to look at the topography. There is a ridge of higher ground, that sort of yellow dotted line there, between the Skitterbeck, which is also known as the East Halton Beck in the west, and the River Humber Estuary in the east. The villages of Harbour, South Killingham, North Killingham, and East Halton, all located along the spine of the ridge. And previous survey of moated sites has identified that there are at least 8 moated sites also running along the ridge, of which we dug parts of 2. So there's a clear local pattern to the distribution of these moated sites. Okay, moving on. The other main topic that we picked up in the medieval period was salt making. Salt making was confined to the outmarsh and focused on Tecni parish. The method used is called sand washing, and at first it seems overly complex, but it has several advantages over other methods. It uses less fuel, which is a resource that was at a premium in the outmarsh. We know from documentary evidence that in some localities, monastic connections imported peats from the Humberhead levels to be used in salt making, and it may be that this was the most common source of fuel for salt making across the area. Another advantage of the sand washing method was that the salt produced was of a high quality. Salt is an important resource used to preserve food. Saltfish was one of Britain's most important trading commodities in the medieval period, and it is used in tanning, cloth dyeing, production of ceramics, and also interestingly is essential for the production of tents, clothing, and other military equipment. Salt could be an important cash crop. So the first stage in the process was to collect material from the beach. Although this technique is called sand washing, they use silts and clays as well as sand. Any deposit exposed to tidal salt water seems to have been exploited. The collection of the material, which was called mould, took place after the spring tide and was therefore linked to a monthly cycle. This is a filtration unit, which comprises a rectangular filtration pit. You can see it there in the photo, and a circular brine pit down the bottom here. Please ignore this strange thing in the middle. That's just a quirk of how this particular one was excavated. The circular brine pit is here again. And that's this deep bit at the end is the brine pit. This is a section, and this one's a plan. And you can see the much shallower filtration pit here. The filtration pits are also called kinches, and they were lined with clay. Sorry, the brine pits were lined with clay, and the filtration pits would have had turfs, turfs in them, which would have acted as a filter. The mould, the material from the beach, was put into the kinch, into the filtration pit, and it was washed through with brine, which would become more concentrated with the picking up the salt from the mould, and they would put the brine through several times until it became concentrated enough that a hen's egg would float in it. So quite a colourful way to test whether your brine is concentrated enough. And historic accounts say that fresh water was used to make the brine rather than using seawater, as this resulted in a purer product. So you'd wash through the filtration pit, and the water would come down this little gully, and it would end up in the brine pit, would be collected. These are examples of the brine pits. We found only a few kinches. These have mostly been truncated by ploughing. We found many more brine pits, which are deeper and so more resistant to removal by ploughing. Each one of the brine pits would have attested. Each one of the brine pits attested to what would have been a former whole filtration unit. So they would have had kinches associated with them, but they'd been removed. And I like these pits because they look like they're smiling at you, and that cheered me up a bit whilst I was deep in paperwork, looking at each of these pits. Very lonely job sometimes being an archaeologist. Two of these pits over here, these brine pits, one is cut through another. So that suggests that there were multiple campaigns of operation, perhaps representing seasonal work or periods of temporary abandonment. And once the salt had been washed out of the mould, the material was then useless, and it was piled up in big Sultan mounds. So huge mounds of waste material were created. It's been estimated that 23 million cubic meters of material were discarded into Sultan mounds just between Humestone and Saltfleet. That's British Geological Survey researchers have suggested that figure. A byproduct of all this material piling up was to raise and dry out areas of the former salt marsh. The salt making operations were pushed gradually seawards as the land was accidentally reclaimed. Ultimately, many Sultan mounds were ploughed out and the areas transformed into agricultural use as they continue to be used today. And we saw that in our excavations. We have salt making features, and then systems of enclosure were imposed onto the top of them. This photo is a section through one of some of the remains of one of the Sultan mounds. You can see all these layers of different material that have been discarded from the salt making process. This particular mound is interesting because it also contained these lumps of clay, these sort of unfired bricks of clay. We think this was probably imported to line the bottom of pits and for other purposes. And in one case, some of the clay that had been imported to line one of the pits contained some Romano-British pottery, probably carried here from wherever the clay had been quarried from, somewhere in the Middlemarsh, probably. And the final stage of the process was to evaporate the concentrated brine in lead pans. We identified some of the hearths where this was probably done. This photo is a photo of one of the hearths. You can see it's only a very shallow sort of feature with some sort of ashy burnt heat transformed clay. The lead pans, of course, would have been readily recycled, so it's not surprising that we didn't find any of those. How are we doing for time? Oh, okay, we're doing nicely. I want to finish by considering the position of the Sultans in the landscape and mentioning some hints at early salt making that we uncovered. I've said how salt making operations were driven eastwards as the waste material piled up. So you would expect to find the earliest operations in the west. This is true in Lincolnshire, of course. In other parts of the country or other countries, the direction may be different. So the medieval sultans we found were to the east of this plan here, and in this area here we found this rather strange strange thing at Tecni Road. It's not the best excavator, so it's a little bit difficult to see, but what this is the flue running through here of a kiln. A kiln would have been under this grass a little bit further over beyond the photograph. We couldn't excavate the kiln body itself as there was a modern bank there. An important piece of drainage infrastructure. We had fragments from a single Romano-British tile. I think there were about 35 fragments of tile, but they could just add up to a single whole tile. Now, I'm not convinced that this is a Romano-British flue. Tiles are very easily reused. I've written up other kilns where Romano-British tiles were used in a medieval context. So I don't think that's very reliable dating evidence. So to interpret this further, we have to turn to other phases of work that were done. There was an evaluation trench 22 there, which was excavated before Wessex Archaeology's involvement with the project, and this excavated by PCAS, and this revealed some briquetage, ceramic associated with salt production, and also some deposits which may have been a Sultan mound. And the Hornsea Project 2 has recovered a few pieces of Saxo-Norman pottery. So I don't know exactly what this adds up to. I've uncovered a few scanty anecdotal claims from the early 20th century of Romano-British salt-making kilns. I think we need to treat that with a little bit of, with a pinch of salt, if you like. And it's more likely that this kiln and further examples of kilns that were revealed by Hornsea Project 2 represent Saxo-Norman activity, early medieval activity, which it may be that these kilns were used for salt working. It's not really what we'd expect. Or it may be that some other industry was operating parallel to salt making. I await the interpretation of the Hornsea 2 results. And yes, here's an overview of the main area of Sultans. These sort of red rectangles are where we found the salt making apparatus. And trench 6 over here, which is slightly west of the main areas, contain gullies and other features that seem to be more in line with evaporation salt making than sand washing. So it may be that they were using these gullies to store seawater that was then just collected in a pan and simply evaporated. It's speculative. We don't have any dating evidence, but this could potentially be an earlier phase of salt making that was then followed by the salt making across most of the site. Great, well, that's the end. I titled this talk with this line from the song Scarborough Fair, where an ex-lover is asked to do an impossible task, tell her to play me an acre of land between the salt water and the sea strand. As I was writing the project up, the line kept jumping into my mind. It reflects the difficult task that the Iron Age, Romano-British, Anglo Saxon and medieval people had as they struggled against the wet conditions of the marsh. May have seemed like an impossible task at the time. They lived in circumstances where poor water management may have had disastrous economic consequences, and they had to devote substantial amounts of labour to the task. The subsistence farmers of the marsh created lives themselves by ploughing in the marginal wetlands. The region is quite isolated, and my main takeaway is the similarities between life in the marsh throughout history until systematic drainage and the railways arrived, until recent times when the marsh was transformed. The song lyric also reflects the accidental land reclamation of the Sultan industry due to the huge amount of byproduct that went into the Sultan mounds. Farmers were able to plough land that once sat between the dry land and the sea. And we've had a bit of a look at the economically important activity of sand washing. I could talk for a much longer time, but I think we're probably about out of time. But we've saved a few minutes for questions.
Thank you, Ashley, for a very interesting talk. And one of the questions is, one of the images and survey data you were showing us was very, very complicated, and there's a lot to take in. There's been quite a lot to take in from the entire webinar, lots of information. Is this, kind of like a once in a lifetime type of site you've been excavating? Was it all the complex ditches and drainage systems? Is this, have you seen anything else like this anywhere else?
Yeah, so we're building up to publication. There's going to be a monograph published very soon. So you'll be able to see all of the detail in there if you're particularly interested in digging deep into this. Each one of these sites is fairly, I don't want to say typical, but there's nothing that extraordinary. What's really important about the results that we've got here is that we've got to transect through a whole region, and we can see how the different sites inhabit that landscape and how they relate to each other. So yes, these are very complex sites, but we do see this kind of complexity sometimes, no, not always. But each individual one is not that. It's not a once in a lifetime sort of affair.
Okay, so you might have a few more of these very complex sites to do yet.
Yeah, they're challenging. Let's say that.
I've got a question about Station Road site as well, and it's was there evidence for 15th century activity at the Station Road site?
No, I don't think there was. There was some question about whether there was some Anglo Saxon activity there, which I think it probably wasn't. I think that was probably maybe a red herring, an early stage in works. But I don't think so. The Station Road site is it's on the boundary between is it Hulton-le-Clay and Tecni. And it's next to, if you know the local area, next to Station Road, near where the old railway station would have been. So yeah, no evidence of medieval activity there I'm aware of.
Okay, and another comment, especially thinking about like the bone comb and some of the lovely things you've shown us. Will people be able to go and see them somewhere at some point?
Yeah, the material's been deposited with North Lincolnshire Museum. I'm not aware of any plans to display the material, but it's in the museum for safekeeping, and maybe they'll choose to exhibit them. I don't know. There's no plans that I'm aware of. But
They
you can
have them
see
at the museum
they're
at
at
the
the
moment.
museum. They're safe. Everything's been done correctly. And I believe there's some photos. There's definitely in the publication there'll be pictures of the artifacts that we've of some of the best artifacts that we've recovered, and I think there was some shared on social media just recently as well.
Oh, lovely. So if people do go and see them, you'll have to on Wessex's social media, you'll have to take a picture and tag us in it so we can see that you've been to visit them. If you do happen to see that, the bone comb or the dog tooth in a museum at some point, we'd love to know.
Some hypothetical future, yeah.
Oh, and just one more question. Sorry, going back to Station Road, it was the 5th century, not the 15th. Sorry, that was my mistake.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, the station. Yes, so we had some pottery which was from the very late 4th century or early 5th century. So I mean, we might just be talking about the first decade of the 5th century, which is still the Romano-British period. But yeah, there was some very late evidence there, and it's the very last features stratigraphically. It's nice. It all fits in as it's supposed to, and they're sort of slightly truncated as well, so they're a little bit ephemeral as they go over the site. Those features are a little bit less deeply dug than earlier features. There's nothing that's conclusively sub-Roman or post-Roman 5th century, but it's still nice to have.